You're listening to Shoe In, covering the ins and outs of all things footwear, from sneakers to heels, loafers to slippers, and every type of shoe in between. Brought to you by the FDRA, the Footwear Industries Association focused on retail, trade, politics, and fashion, helping create and enhance conversations on all things footwear.
All right, folks. So this show, we cover everything related to the footwear business side. And there was this thing called COVID. I don't know if you remember that or not. Some people keep blocking
Trying to forget it.
That's fine. There was this thing called COVID. Right now, I'm a little worried about this bird flu from cattle in Texas, but that's a different thing, folks. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. But for many, many years, FDRA had events in Asia and always had boots on the ground at least twice a year, like many of the sourcing executives out there who constantly visit to be on the production lines. COVID disrupted that, but proud to announce that Mr. Matt Priest is fresh back from Vietnam, having boots on the ground in Vietnam. Matt, you've been in Vietnam before. Like you were there before COVID hit because production was shifting down there. You were the one person in the whole industry who said there's capacity, and there was continued capacity when people are like,
right,
it's going to tap out. There's not enough. Like we're in, and you were like, there's still capacity, right? So going back to Vietnam this time after COVID, what's the difference? What did you feel? What did you see? What's the difference in the last 4 or 5 years for manufacturing in Vietnam?
Yeah, great question, Andy. And I don't know if you can ever be fresh back from any place in Asia, but just because it kicks your butt physically. But it was quite different in a lot of ways. I traveled to Saigon, to Ho Chi Minh City, which is one of obviously the main areas of production is in and around the area in the south. There's production up north in Hanoi, closer to the Chinese border. But the trip was great because first and foremost, Vietnam is just a beautiful country. Our country has ties, both strained and hard and difficult ties, as well as beautiful and redemptive. And there's just a lot you can unpack between the U.S. and Vietnam. But the people are just so open and welcoming and warm. And the country's open. You don't need 3 VPNs to go to Google when you're there, like you do in China, right? You can check Gmail if you had to. It's just a more opening society that welcomes the American investment and participation in its economy. So there's that. But when you get on the ground, back in the day, it's probably the most concentrated amount of motorbikes, mopeds, and other motorcycles that you'll ever see in your life in the world. And you'll see families of 4 on a moped going to and from wherever they're headed. And there's still a lot of that, but I saw there was more and more actual automobiles on the road. You can tell there's wealth that's coming into the country at really impressive clips. You can tell that tech is there, high tech is there. You can tell that logistics are up and running in a lot of different ways. You can tell obviously footwear continues and apparel continues to be a big part of the Vietnamese economy. Even around, I stayed at the Sheraton Saigon, which is a typical kind of Western hotel in the middle of District 1 in Ho Chi Minh City. It's jam-packed. There's a ton of traffic. But the stores, even the stores around the hotel went from kind of local regionalized stores to luxury brands. There's multiple malls. There was a vibe that there's a lot of economic activity happening there in the country when I got there that felt different from when I was there 4 or 5 years ago.
Interesting. You also attended Wolverine Worldwide's Supplier Summit.
Yeah.
What was the conversation like with the factory and material owners and managers, from the plant-based perspective?
Yeah, great question. And I've spoken at this event with Wolverine, I think 10 years now. They've been gracious to me and invited me to Southern China and then Macau for a number of years, now to Ho Chi Minh City. And Wolverine does such a good job because they have a multitude of brands. They're obviously operating in different countries and they have different manufacturing partners. They do such a good job of bringing everyone together and then having the leadership there, company leadership, Chris Huff, Janice, who runs Merrill, Rob, who runs Saucony, the Hong Kong leadership that runs all sourcing and supply chain, brings everyone in a room and says, this is where the company is. This is what our vision is. This is where we're headed. And it really helps kind of solidify the ways in which they're communicating with their factories in both good times and bad. And so I think kudos to them for doing that. If you're a company that's not kind of bringing together your factory base in one space over a 1 or 2 day period in a centralized Singapore, Hong Kong, Macau, Dongguan, Ho Chi Minh, whatever, something you should really consider doing, because I think it helps just streamline communication and shows leadership, it exposes leadership to kind of what's happening on the production side within your company, which I think is really important. We have to realize that the factories were drinking from a fire hose of orders for a number of years. I mean, historic numbers we will never see again in our lifetime, Andy, on orders and volume and value. And that's gone. It's dried up. And so there's a correction happening that's necessary. And it's not even just specific to Wolverine. It's broad base. Every company you talk to is dealing with the same thing. And so the factories are trying to understand, okay, it's light. The orders are real light right now. Right. What's the forecast look like? How do we plan for that? Which any astute business owner needs to know. How do I plan? If it's good, bad, or otherwise, just give me what the news is going to be so I can plan. And I think there was a lot of that conversation about what's the American economy look like? What's the consumer going to look like over the next year? And then how, as companies, all companies are right-sizing inventory, how does that impact the factories? Those were the big questions of the day. But it wasn't downbeat or dreadful. It just was kind of like, this is the reality of the pendulum that swung back and forth for the last 4 years. How do we deal with it?
I mean, it's the same thing that retailers are asking of consumers, right? Like it's I don't know whether it's upstream or downstream, but it's the same conversation as how much money do people have in their pockets and how much shoes are they going to buy with it? And then this is the same thing where it's how many shoes do you need me to produce to fill that demand? So getting everybody together to give those forecasts, to set expectations, I think helps a lot. As you said, you also visited Ortholite, our partners at Ortholite. You visited their facility, and I'm interested from a supplier to a factory making insoles and components. Your visit with them, what did you see at their facilities that really intrigued you or surprised you?
Yeah, great question, Andy. And it was a great visit with Ortholite because you're right. It was a company that is innovative, that is trying to work with all the big brands. And so we were able to tour 2 facilities. We taped a lot of content forthcoming. I'm very excited about. We had a lot of fun with it. The Ortholite team was great. The Vietnamese staff they have there are phenomenal. The expats are amazing. And so we went to 2 facilities and I saw clean, innovative, sustainably focused operations. They have their eye on what innovation looks like and should be looking like. They're doing some really cool things that we can unveil over the next few months on the innovation side, on the outsole side, on the sustainability side. And they're just really in tune with their company, their factory partners, and also their branded partners. And because they kind of sit in that middle, right? They're producing components that are shipped to a manufacturer who serves a brand. And there's this triangulation that happens. And so walking through their production facility, seeing the swoosh and seeing the 3 stripes and seeing these iconic logos on these components was really cool. I mean, we nerd out on this stuff, but it's really neat to go in and see product that I'm familiar with, that I've worn on my feet, and how the components are being constructed, and to see some of the machines that they're using. And I won't spoil the whole thing, but they have some machines. They have 5 of these machines in one of their facilities, or 7 of these machines in one of their facilities, and there are only 12 in the whole world. And so you felt like you were kind of in this spot where innovation happens and it's not happening anywhere else. And we'll tease that out a bit. But it was cool to be with them because they do serve such an important part of the industry, and they go where the industry is leading them, meaning they're setting up shop there and they're investing millions and millions of dollars because the industry's gone there. Right. Yeah. And so they're those really good partners in that way.
And if you haven't listened, we did an interview with Glenn, the founder of Ortholite, not long ago. Yeah. And I encourage everybody to go back and listen to that. Because one thing that was really important to Glenn and to Ortholite itself is the workers that they have in those facilities. And I think they really dig hard to think about the social impacts they have. We talk a lot about sustainability from product and impacts, but they also really lean hard into their people. So I'm sure you saw that. And the other thing we always talk about Ortholite with too, and one narrative that we'll be having more of conversation around for sustainability is cost and innovation considerations. Because I think a lot of brands don't appreciate your point about they have these machines that no one else has, right? So they're trying to do the right thing, but we also had to have conversations between brands and suppliers around cost and innovation. Like, what do you need and how can we work together on this stuff? And how can it not be a conversation about cost, right? Like, there's a cost to everything and we can have those conversations, but how can we drive value and figure out the cost along the way versus a project just getting halted? And I hear a lot of this, project just getting halted by a brand because they're like, well, it costs too much. It's like, okay, like that's a consideration, but how do you then get around it? How do you work once the cost is in consideration? How do you go ahead and address those frictions second and third? Like, what else is the impediment that you could be working on separate to cost? So there's these things where we have in our industry, and it's every business, but we get held up and we hold ourselves hostage so much to cost that we forget that there's a relationship and there's an understanding and there's conversation. So, I'm excited that in Boston in May, we're having that conversation. It's not an event. It's not a summit where we're having lectures. It's a meeting where we're talking to each other to facilitate those things. So if you want to know more, you can contact me, but it's going to be on sustainability. It's going to be on biomaterials. It's going to be on strategy, especially on traceability strategy and data impact strategy, and then circularity. A new way of looking at circularity. I think we've looked at it all wrong. I've looked at it all wrong for years. You have new ways forward. So excited about that. You also visited, past my plug, you also visited with, I think, Croft, other brands while you're in Vietnam. Maybe, do you have any, bits of information from those visits or anything that you can share that in terms of what's happening with manufacturing in Vietnam?
Yeah. So it ties back to your point on the people, Andy. So the interesting thing about Vietnam that our listeners may or may not be aware of, many of our listeners probably are. In fact, when I was in Vietnam, I had a number of people say they listened to this program. So super grateful that people do in Vietnam. Thank you for listening. But Vietnam doesn't have the migrant worker culture that China has, right? Mm-hmm. So there's not 100 million people or whatever the number is these days migrating from the inner provinces to the coastal provinces in China. In Vietnam, they don't have any of that. Everyone goes home, to their towns and their villages and their cities, which is very helpful on the working hours and wages aspect. And so there's this community feel in these factories. And so I visited a Crocs factory, and saw just some amazing innovation there. Obviously the Ortholite facilities. And the neat thing about it is even at Ortholite, the head of the factory has on his wall a picture he's taken with each individual worker in the entire facility, and there are hundreds and hundreds of workers. And then they'll have like non-required kind of festival Saturdays or family hangouts on the property where they do some fun thing. And I think this does definitely start with Glenn. And 80% of their workforce shows up to just hang out and have a good time and socialize because it feels like a family, and they go home at 5:00. So it just is a totally different vibe than you would get in other locations around the world. Yeah. And I think that speaks to the cultural environment in Vietnam. Again, a more open society, the lack of migration. And as we've said for many, many years, Western brands bring these values to these locations, and then they train up local folks to be managers. And the head of sustainability is a Vietnamese guy who has a ton of experience in other products in Vietnam. There's engineers, and they listen to their workforce on process improvements that drive more sustainability, that drive more efficiency and more business. And it's all Vietnamese driven. So we are like really helping to drive an economy and empower local workers to help be a part of the solutions to our collective challenges. And I saw that in every factory I went to. And then lastly, just checking in with our brand partners who all have, folks on the ground, whether it's Claris or Nike in Ho Chi Minh, who are tracking legislation or they're tracking sampling, they're engaging with the manufacturers. It's just a great, it was a 6-night trip. I was in the air 2 nights, on the ground 4 nights, and I met with tons of people. And it's just because there's a lot of activity going on there. It's kind of a footwear mecca right now. Yeah.
It's interesting you talk about the workforce because, in China, the way it's worked obviously is traditionally migrants would come in, they train them intensely, they work for 9 months or so, they go back home, and then there's a new wave that come in. Some of that's changing, yes. It's interesting to hear about Vietnam because you have more wise workforce, more empowered workforce, more community. But I don't, and to your point at the beginning, you said there's a rising tide of the economy there. Labor costs have always driven footwear outside of to China, overseas, from Korea to Taiwan to China to Vietnam. And now we're seeing some of it peel into Cambodia or India or elsewhere as people dip their toe to try to find reduced labor costs. Like, did you have any conversations about that? Because labor in Vietnam is either equal or above China as a whole now. And did you see more automation or hear more automation in order to help like tackle some of those bigger challenges where in China you can just throw 100 people at a problem? Are we seeing more automation? And my question is around the longevity of Vietnam as a sourcing footprint and the capacity. Can it still grow?
Yeah, I think, okay, so there's a couple points there, and I think they're really valid questions, Andy. So there's a lot of innovation happening there. The factories were very clean. There were some I wouldn't even call pristine. Not all of them, but there was one in particular that was highly pristine, didn't have a ton of people involved in utilizing the machines and working through the machines. So there's a ton of innovation there. And it used to be just an athletic footwear landscape. So the Nikes and Adidas and Under Armours of the world were blazing the trail. This was a decade, this was years ago. Now it's everyone. Everyone can make in Vietnam, and they have the capacity and the capabilities of doing it. But is there more capacity? Yeah. I mean, I was in industrial parks that had tons of space but there's competition on that capacity because of other industries that have come to town, particularly in the era of the Trump tariffs, that drove a lot of high tech industries into Vietnam because they didn't have any duties on them. And then they fled China under the Trump tariffs. And so you're seeing some of it bleed into Cambodia. Cambodia continues to show strength on the export side of the U.S. market. Last year, everyone was down, so it's kind of hard to gauge, but they still are well positioned to absorb some of that. And I had more and more about Bangladesh while I was in Vietnam. And so the question comes down to, can we elongated the supply chain out of China into Vietnam. We're still bringing materials down, but a number of brands said in a year or two, we'll be almost fully integrated into Vietnam and not have to be relying on materials from China. So there's a conscious effort to try to shorten that supply chain again and come out of China on the material side. And so I think Vietnam, in fact, even talking to one of the expats, because every once in a while, the prices in China are really competitive right now. And so everyone's like, oh, let's go back to China. And a lot of the expats like, no, we're not going back to China. The chase is for cheap labor. We like living here, and we think it's a better business environment to operate in, even if it's a little bit more expensive. So I think those are the intangible things that aren't on a spreadsheet. I think those things will continue to win the day, even if China's the most competitive pricing it's ever seen, which I've heard a number of people say.
Very interesting. Very interesting. That sounds, this conversation is so different than 5 years ago when we were talking about.
Right.
Is the industry changing a bit in terms of like how it considers, you got to look at the quality of product that you can produce, the speed, the materiality. It sounds like Vietnam is matured to the point to where it's old man, right? It's like graduated from a child to a man at this point in terms of footwear sourcing, where it's mature, it's wise, it's able, it's agile. The material point that you just made, I think, is the most important point. Kind of self-reliance, local suppliers of local manufacturing. Because what happened during COVID was the border got closed and they couldn't get the materials. So Vietnam was running, factories were running, but they didn't have the materials because China was closed. I also wonder, because I always have these curious thoughts, but can you imagine factories being built near the border of Vietnam with other Southeast Asian countries and using migrant labor from Laos or other countries to come over and go back and forth and leverage that? Because we're both from North Carolina. We've both been to Carowinds. Carowinds is an amusement park that travels both North and South Carolina. You can stand on a line where at one part your foot is in North Carolina and the other foot is in South Carolina. It is amazing. And you can see a roller coaster over your head. So
that's true. I agree. What was that called? What's that roller coaster called?
Thunder Road?
Yeah, that's right.
Like the one?
It may have changed. I remember Thunder Road. Yeah.
Hey, I can imagine a factory on both sides. It'd be a taxing logistical nightmare, but hey, legal teams can figure it out. No problem.
The last thing I'll say, Andy, real quick, is one of the negatives is a little bit smoggier in Vietnam that I remember, because I remember I would go on these trips to Dongguan and I didn't see the sun. And then I would fly out to Vietnam. And I would get there and it'd be like being in paradise because the sun was out. It's not, you can still see the sun, but it's definitely, you can tell it's more industrialized than it was before. So
can't be worse than Putin in China. I'm sorry. There's no, it can't be worse.
Shout out to Joe Passi, who's probably there right now.
Oh my God. Poor Joe. As we kind of wrap this up, we do have a summit coming up in July in New York that will focus a lot on this. And I think it behooves folks to attend these events and engage with us, because we crunch the data, but also having the ability to talk to sourcing executives on the ground who are blunt and open with us because we have their trust and maintain their trust to understand these dynamics, to your point about how the intangibles of the industry and what it really means. And I think, the other point too, I would say in Vietnam, it's very interesting around like the sustainable development and the innovations that are happening there with like solar panel on roofs, and as new factories pop up, the ability to like integrate more innovations there, because we don't have legacy. And I feel like in China, there's just a lot of legacy factories and things are trying to squeeze their investment out of, which makes complete sense. But when you start moving and shaking, and that's why I'm always, the next conversation is going to be on India, I think, because that really is when you're building new factories for footwear. It's like, what are those looking like versus what we had in the past? So that's a little teaser to what we think about here and who we're talking to, and maybe a next episode. But with that, absolutely great conversation on this and insight. And I love the fact that when Matt goes somewhere, he's like keenly aware of societal issues, the economic issues. And like, I think, not to toot our own horn, we're actually good listeners. I know we live in DC, so we're supposed to talk a lot. And I do, obviously. I have a podcast or two, but at least Matt on our team is a good listener. I won't say that I am.
No, you are too, man. You are too. You travel the world. You're culturally adept. No, I have to toot your horn as well.
We do. Is like, we do listen. There's no like hubris to what we're trying to. We're curious enough to figure out like what is happening, and there's not. We're trying to help people and our members understand and look through kind of the chaos of the market and kind of the fog of sourcing to try to get a better foothold and an understanding to make those decisions. Because as you said, Wolverine's getting together and they're trying to map it out across the whole supply chain of like, what's the direction? And I think it's really hard. It's a hard thing right now, because I think that direction, because of the winds of change everywhere, Scorpions, is a 6-month, there you go, probably a 6-month reassessment versus maybe even monthly. So with that, that'll keep running. Missing the winds of sourcing shoes. Take me. We appreciate you listening to this episode. We'll talk to you next week. Every Monday drops a new one, shoe and show. Well, the wind blows right there. All right, we're out.
Shoe In has been brought to you by the FDRA, the Footwear Industries Association focused on retail, trade, politics, and fashion, helping create and enhance conversations on all things footwear. For information about FDRA, visit fdra.org.